Unique New York. Unique New York.
Oh, this part of Colin's body.
Don't tow me. Stop towing me.
Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature has intended that you have to be a
healthy, happy sex life is the most wonderful and terribly unpleasant. We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Hello, fabulous people. I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
And
welcome to Remedial Sex Ed. Yay.
Happy June. We are at the end of June, but happy June.
Happy June. Happy Pride
June,
Month.
Early July. It's fine.
Yeah, / early July.
So June is famous in the zeitgeist for being Pride Month.
Yes.
Across the world, with a few exceptions here and
Bad
there.
exceptions.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's funny because it's Pride Month because of America. We have forced June to be Pride Month, and it's across the nations. And while, we're usually really bad for doing things like that, I'm good with this one.
This is a good enforcement of our culture, yeah.
Yeah.
The kind of imperialism you want to see in the world.
Yeah. Oh, what a sentence I bet you never thought we'd say.
So, Marcella, you are based out of New York City. Are you
Sure
excited
am.
for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall?
50th anniversary equals World Pride being hosted in New York. Things are so queer here, guys. It's amazing.
Is it just rainbows everywhere?
Rainbows literally everywhere. I mean, we can talk about commercialism and pride at another point. But yes,
Whole nother episode.
Every storefront, so many extra sex shops, like pop-up sex shops, have showed up on the streets. It's been great. There have been very sexy festivals and street fairs, and I saw a musical that is, oh God, what's it called? Camp Morningwood, a very naked musical. It was just penises bouncing as choreography.
Sounds
yes.
exciting.
Yes, New York City is very, very gay, very queer. We are here.
Oh, so let's talk about what Stonewall is.
Yeah, I guess today we wanted to talk about why it's Pride Month, which we usually can trace back to the Stonewall Riots on June 28th, 1969.
That we can.
That is correct. I feel like one thing we wanted to say is that, like, originally we had plans of doing a lot more episodes during Pride Month about the Pride community and not waiting until the last possible second. But thank you, listeners, for being back this week after our 2-part series on abortion, because we just couldn't ignore what was happening.
Yeah, current events sort of.
They took over
our
our Pride Month.
Yes.
Yeah, we had it all planned out. It was going to be so good. We were going to have a week of L, a week of G, and B and T, and so forth.
And we were going to talk about what the other letters mean, because I think a lot of people get confused into the Q's, the I's, the A's.
Yes.
Sometimes the P's.
So the other thing we realized is, guess what? There are gay people all year round. So even though we maybe didn't get to do those episodes this month, that doesn't mean that we can't do them any other time of the year, because we're pro the gays all year round.
Yeah,
we
podcast
love
is
the gays.
24/7 pro gay.
But the reason we're doing this episode today is because we did want to do a very important Pride episode for Pride Month.
A very special episode, if you will.
A special episode, because we are literally, 3 days away from the anniversary of the Stonewall Riots, which led to the very first Pride Parade.
I think this is technically coming out after the 50th anniversary, but it's okay.
We're recording in recording time. We are in the past.
In the past times.
In case you were wondering, we edit this.
Shockingly.
Surprise? So are we.
I like to think we've gotten better over time.
All right, so 1969. Let's put a frame of where the world is before the Stonewall Riots happened.
A dark, black and white, terrible place.
That it was. So, throughout history, the homosexual community has been seen in many different lights.
Some people say that, or some scholars say that it wasn't homosexuality that sort of had to be invented, but a strict definition of heterosexuality that had to be invented right at the beginning of the modern era, and the definition of heterosexuality and like the primacy of the family unit sort of crystallizes around the Victorian era, and so that's when you first start seeing homosexual behavior being really strictly criminalized in the way that we recognize today.
That's actually true across the board for a lot of things regarding sex. The rules regarding sex were not that strict pre-Victorian era. In fact, cheating was almost encouraged throughout the 1700s. And then with the dawn of that came this new, really strict code of morality that started kind of within Protestant faith and then took off.
Yeah,
like a madman.
I'd say it even starts with the, shortly after the Reformation.
Mm-hmm. So, at the turn of the century in the 1900s, all 50 states and every single province of Canada had anti-homosexuality laws on the books. In fact, every country had some form of laws essentially criminalizing homosexual behavior. These were extreme to the point of if you were found even in a gay bar, you could get arrested. The bathhouses were constantly raided by police. On top of rules against sodomy, there were also rules in California. It was called rules against impersonating a woman. In New York City, it was regarded as masquerading.
You had to have a minimum of 3 articles of clothing of your gender.
Very targeted towards the trans community. And these were on the books across the nation for years. For example, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., Representative Arthur Miller, a Republican from Nebraska, passed anti-sodomy laws in 1948 that would remain until 1995.
Yes. Oh, now I don't know off the top of my head, but Texas was one of the last to remove the anti-sodomy laws.
The very first country in the world that would decriminalize homosexuality was Canada. And they actually did it before the Stonewall Riots. So the bill was introduced. It's Bill C-150, also known as the Omnibus Bill. It was introduced in 1967 and was passed in 1969 in May by Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, who would later become the 15th Prime Minister.
Yeah, and the dad of the current Prime Minister.
Also, yes.
Yeah, Justin. Handsome Justin.
What a family.
Good to know. So that is right before the Stonewall Riots in May of '69. So why was that getting passed, Meg?
So it's an interesting dichotomy. So in Canada, while this was being debated, there were a lot of counter protests with the common rhetoric against the bill. With the common rhetoric you will see even today with it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve.
Sure.
The ever classic God hates fags. All the classics were there, but there was an even bigger push, and what it really came down to, I believe it was Minister Trudeau who said this, the government has no place in the bedroom. And he later went on to have this be an issue of privacy rights between two people. And as soon as they changed the narrative into right for privacy, it it passed. Not by a landslide, but it passed.
Kind of in the face of public opinion. It seems like the bill was a little bit ahead of its time.
Yeah, I looked up when the Texas decision was made, and it was actually 14 states that in 2003 were no longer able to have sodomy laws because of the reversal of the decision of Lawrence versus Texas. So that's why Texas stuck in my brain. But actually, 14 states had anti-sodomy laws until 2003, including
one of them?
Good old Utah.
Nice. Good job, guys.
We'll shame those states.
It's just such a weird frame of mind to be in. Like, how do you even... I can't imagine a state that would enforce that. Like, it's just such an invasion of privacy.
Well, maybe we should talk about how it was enforced at the Stonewall Inn, for instance.
That's correct. So on top of all of these laws that were on the books to essentially oppress the homosexual and trans community, because just because you're one doesn't necessarily mean you're the other.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
In fact, in 1969, the concept of being transgender didn't quite exist as it did today. And so there was a very porous line between being a transvestite, a drag queen, and being transgender, which I think is part of what leads to the confusion between those terms today, in that it is a relatively new category, even newer than the still very new categories of gay and lesbian.
In the 50s, you get the idea of the atomic family being sold as the only road to happiness.
Nuclear family.
What did I say?
You said the
Atomic family.
Nice.
Which would be awesome. They would be superheroes or horrible mutants.
Yeah. I think we should change the term.
Yeah, change it to atomic family.
Atomic family.
No, the atomic family is the millennial ideal with like 2 dads and 3 moms, and
And instead of kids, you have like a cat.
Well, you have kids, but you also have cats and dog and plants.
I'm more in for the just having multiple partners and pets thing. That sounded good, Colin. Let's go back to that.
Or is the atomic family just the collective
I mean,
of
we
society?
call that
the
a
atomic
pod.
family.
Yeah.
The atomic family. Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, duh. There's
Anyway.
already a term for that.
Okay. So,
But I like to call it the atomic family now.
in the 50s, there was one promoted way to be. In order to be a success in America, it was the idea of a working father, a stay-at-home mom, 2.5 kids, living in the suburbs, living the perfect life. And anytime you saw this perfect family advertised in America, they were always white. Every single time. When the government started producing anti-homosexuality videos for public schools, they would play on the narrative that if we allowed homosexuality to be accepted in society, it would ruin the narrative of the family. They would play on parents' beliefs that if you let your children hang around people who identified as homosexual, they would grow up to be homosexual, as though it was something you could catch.
Catch the gay.
Catch the gay.
Catch the big gay.
And on top of this, homosexuality was actually considered a mental disease. And the American Psychology Association would consider it a mental disease up until 1973.
Wow.
So not only was it illegal and you could be arrested, you could be fired from your job if your company found out that this was happening. There were like so many different consequences. But because it was considered a mental illness, you could be put into these institutions in order to quote unquote solve your gay. And the things that they would do were lobotomies or electroshock therapy using gay porn and sterilization. They would make it so that you couldn't have an erection anymore. And if that isn't bad enough, they also gave you a drug that simulated the experience of drowning, which is basically just waterboarding you without having the actual water, according to the documentary that we were talking about. And so it, like, in the documentary, they talked about one of these institutions called Atascadero, and the person refers to it as the Dachau for queers. And if that doesn't scare you, then, like, I don't understand. Like, the extremes that we put people through for just trying to be themselves and express their love in the only way that they know how was just so dramatically horrible.
Again, this was America in the 60s.
Yeah, in the late 60s.
And Atascadero was in California.
Yeah.
Back in the time frame that we're talking about, the homosexual community was sold as appearing to be vagrants. They were people who were weird and lived in the ghetto and were addicted to drugs and had mental problems. And A, no, they were not. But B, for the people who were out, the reason they were out is because they had literally nothing to lose.
Yes.
And they did live in the ghettos because that's the only place they could live.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were addicted to drugs because how else are you supposed to cope with life? It was a situation that people selling this narrative cornered them into. You know, a lot of people lost their jobs for coming out of the closet, and the only job they could get was walking the street as a prostitute.
Yeah. Being outed out of the closet because it wasn't, you didn't come out. Like, there was no being out because it was so detrimental to your life then. And it was, you talked about police raids and how constant they were. And it wasn't like, it was also at just, like, bars. Like, if bars got a reputation of being a gay bar, then they would constantly be raided by the police, and they would pick up your ID. And the documentary mentioned publishing names and names, birth dates, and sometimes addresses in the newspaper if you were found to be a homosexual. And it was all about just outing you and beating you. There was so much violence to the gay community at that time. The cops would use the bully sticks on patrons that they found to be gay. It was a violent, horrible time.
It was absolutely horrible. And in terms of the bars, again, creating a shitty situation that the government created and then sold as the narrative to hate these people. The bars that they could go to, essentially the organization that stood up to start gay bars was, of course, the mob.
Yes, it was all the crime families, because they could set up these bars that didn't have liquor license and didn't have any regulations, like, you know, having a fire escape or having running water to wash all the dishes or anything like that. They could avoid all of that by paying off the cops so that they would get a tip whenever a raid was going to happen, so that they could put away all the alcohol and hide everything. And then still provide, you know, watered down drinks to all of the clientele that wanted a safe space to meet. Because the reason we were going to all of these quote unquote sketchy places wasn't because we wanted to be sketchy, but because that was the only place that, like, these people could go to express themselves and to be with their partners and to socialize with other like-minded people.
Yep.
Yeah, the documentary mentioned that it was either bars or the street or porno movie theaters, but, you know, a bar like the Stonewall was the only place where you could actually dance or, like, have a real conversation with someone or just hang out socially, and you're not just, you know, having these furtive encounters in an alley or in a movie theater. A place like the Stonewall was the only place where you could be gay and have that as part of an identity and not just like a dirty habit that you did, like something that you could express and explore as part of yourself and part of your identity. And, you know, it's funny because the Stonewall was one of these mob bars, so it wasn't exactly a safe place. The mob didn't care one way or the other what happened to gay people. They just wanted to make money off of them. People really risked everything to come to these places where they could be, they're sort of a safe haven, but they could also be raided at any second and, you know, get beat up, or worse, get taken to jail and have their life ruined.
Mm-hmm. And again, to iterate, all of this happened in New York City. All of this happened in San Francisco. All of this happened in places that gay people would go because at least there was a higher concentration in the community to be part of.
Yeah, you were escaping any type of rural home if you could, so that you could, like, meet other people that you could identify with. Just imagine how isolating it would be for a part of your identity to be so... for it to be revealed would be so detrimental to your life that you could be best friends with people in your neighborhood that would also be gay or queer and everything like that, but neither of you would know. Neither of you would be that willing to be that open, because it would absolutely destroy your life and livelihood.
Which is why I think it's important that it's still called a Pride Festival, because the default setting has been shame and silence for so long, so that, you know, at least for one day or 1 month out of the year, they get to come out and be unabashedly just proud of who they are.
Mid-60s, we start seeing marches regarding the civil rights move. We have a bigger push for gender equality. And as all of these movements are going on, of course, the homosexual community begins to chime in. We see pushes for same-sex attraction rights starting in the mid-60s. They begin not necessarily a march, but small gatherings. And they took the same tactic that the civil rights protests did, in which case they established a dress code. Men had to show up in suits. Ladies had to show up in dresses and heels. And the entire strategy behind this was so that these people would appear to be normal. Yeah. Which, of course, they were. But the more you paint yourself and dress yourself to look like everyone around you, the more they will accept you, because that's how society works.
Yep.
And it's really funny. So in the same documentary that we keep coming back to, they actually have a news clip of the organizer of, what's the committee called?
The Mattachine Society?
Yes. The organizer of that from Miami. And when he talks about the gay movement, he is like, these people just want to be out. They just want to be alive. They just want to live a normal life. And he openly said, marriage is not on the mind of the gay community. Let me assure you that.
Yeah.
And he was right. At that point in time in history, it truly was just about being able to live your life.
Yeah, it was unfathomable to get to the point in society where they would be able to marry the people that they loved, or that they would be able to raise children. Like, these were concepts that just couldn't even be imagined at that point to be right. Just to be out was all we needed.
Mm-hmm. And so that, in summary, is where we were. That is all of our exposition for one pivotal moment. Right before the Stonewall Riots happened, New York City started upping the amount of raids, specifically against the homosexual community.
Because it was an election year.
Yeah. It's an election year. The constituents in Greenwich Village, where Stonewall was and a lot of gay bars were starting to push back against the mayor.
The bar was raided the Tuesday.
Yes.
Just before. The stories of a lot of the people who were there is that they had been arrested multiple times before this point. And this raid was not their first experience with the cops. And essentially, they were just kind of over it.
Yeah, tensions had been rising. I think everyone likes to mention it was the day of Judy Garland's funeral. Queen Judy, gay icon.
June 27th, 1969. It was a Friday night after midnight, so technically June 28th, 1969. 8 plainclothed cops, or undercover cops, entered the bar, and they started targeting all of the drag queens, the Stonewall employees, and the women or lesbians that were dressed not of their gender or weren't wearing the 3 articles of clothing that were necessary by law at the time.
The mafia hadn't been tipped off. I think usually people who weren't wearing the 3 articles of clothing required would like typically try to dive away before the cops would get there or something like that. But this time there wasn't anything like that. They just arrived and started beating people with their bully sticks and, you know, forcing gender checks where they would pull people that were presenting as women into bathrooms and like see what their genitalia was. And
they started the raid. They were just arresting all of these people. And as everybody is clearing out of the bar, usually what would happen is people would leave, right? They didn't want to stay. They didn't want to stick around. They didn't want to be seen as part of this culture. But that night, everyone stuck around on the streets. So as the police are being abusive and brutal in their arresting of these people, they specifically started hurting a lesbian. And she was like fighting back. The handcuffs were too tight on her, and she started telling people reportedly she was telling people like, why are you just watching? Like, we need to fight back. Then Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are believed to have started the riot because they grabbed either bottles or bricks or trash, anything, and started throwing it at the cop cars.
And if I'm correct, people started actually coming to them as well. Like, those who were in the Greenwich Village, because there was people in the bar.
Later
and then
on in the night,
people from the street started showing up.
So once the fight turned into a riot, people from all over Greenwich started showing up. Yeah, as the night went on, more and more people started gathering, and the police sort of realized that they were losing control of the situation. Interestingly, they were also unable to reach the precinct on their radios, so they were sort of outnumbered. So they had a couple people in cuffs, and they went inside the bar, and by that point, they've more or less lost control of the situation as people are gathering outside, and it starts to become a little moment of solidarity between everybody in the village. You know, somebody shouts gay power. There are people singing we will overcome, and it starts to crystallize into this moment where a broad spectrum of the LGBT community begins to realize that they have power with each other, and they start to fight back. Didn't they burn the Stonewall?
They attempted to set the building on fire. And like I mentioned earlier, if the mafia owns the building and they pay off the cops, there's no fire exit. So part of it was like they had to save people from inside the building. And here's the thing. Everybody keeps saying that like any type of protesting we do today is offensive, or people aren't doing it the right way, or there's a better way to talk about it. Like, for example, kneeling at the American flag. Everybody talks about how there are so many different ways where we're being disrespectful, but for any progress to happen, if you look at history, you kind of got to get a little disrespectful. Like, you have to fight for your rights. You have to break some windows. This wasn't just, you know, white gay males that were doing all of this fight, like you may have seen in the recent movie about Stonewall, which is gross. But no, people give a lot of credit to Martha P. Johnson, who was a trans drag queen, who was recognized by many people to be one of the initiators of the riot.
They didn't talk about Martha P. Johnson in the American Experience documentary watch, which I thought was interesting because she's a name you always hear. Hers was the brick. She threw the brick heard round the world. You know,
yeah.
It said that. Yeah, somewhat. It may or not be true, but the story goes that she climbed up a lamppost and threw a brick down on a cop car, and that's what really got the riot going.
I just have to say, I love that the P in Martha P. Johnson, which if asked about that letter or about what gender she was or whatever, she would respond with, "Pay it no mind," which I think is lovely and great.
It's a great response.
Such a great response. Marcia, pay it no mind.
I think one of my favorite tactics that I saw was when the queens, to resist arrest as the cops were coming for them, just linked arms and started a kick line.
Yeah.
Which, according to the people they interviewed, was just like, it confused the fuck out of them.
Which is all I've ever wanted. Is just to confuse cops.
After the first night, there was a bunch of broken glass, some pretty trashed cop cars. They tried to burn down the building. The cops leave, and they come back the next night with much greater numbers in full SWAT riot gear, with the helmets and the full body shields and the batons and everything. And to greet them at the Stonewall as a much larger gathering of the LGBT community.
Not to mention some of the Panthers and the Young Lords.
The queer community was very active during the civil rights movement because it was something that they could fight for and still stay in the closet. So, yes, there were definitely, Stonewall was not the beginning of the gay rights movement in the United States. As you said, Megan, there were many organizations that were started before it. This did start 2 organizations. But yeah, basically these were people that were all trying to support each other because we were all other in different ways.
So the riot goes on. It comes to an end, and what we have afterwards is a semi-united community with a lot of steam, and they know that they have to take this steam somewhere. They know it can't just end with the riot, and they're talking about what the next step is. And essentially what they do is they organize the very first Pride March. And as people are showing up to this march, they are terrified, because when they begin at Christopher Street, it's just a couple hundred people. If you look at a couple hundred people on New York City, it's very bitty. It's a very baby number. And as people are organizing to this march, you have to remember they are out openly walking down the city streets as members of this community. Something that they can get arrested for, they can get ostracized for, their families will never talk to them again, they will get fired. Like, a lot is at stake to be out there marching for this cause. And once they begin on Christopher Street, the way that the people in the documentary and people who participated in this march describe it is the first run. Like, it wasn't just a casual, fun march as it is today. They were booking it out of fear. But as they begin their journey, what begins to happen is more people come and line the streets. More people come and join their walk. And by the end of it, there were thousands. And it really did solidify the Pride movement as we know it today.
So, a lot of people who were involved in the riots were upset with how the Mattachine Society, whom we had discussed before, were handling things. They were sort of very moderate, very peaceful. And after the Stonewall riots, a lot of the community didn't want to abide by those rules anymore. They wanted to be who they were, and proud of themselves. So they formed the Gay Liberation Front, which was a more radical movement and the first homophile association to use gay in its name.
And this process of Pride has had many different forms over the past 50 years. It started with just the right to exist. And during the 70s, the community joined in their own version of the sexual revolution. For those of you who have not seen the movie Harvey Milk, I highly recommend it. That took place in the late 70s, right? Proposition 6 in California, which was proposed to make it legal for employers to discriminate against you upon your sexual preference, was almost passed in the state of California. in very recent history. As soon as we get into the 80s, it became the right to remain alive. Because the AIDS crisis swept over the gay community like nothing seen in the 20th century before. Nothing seen like it since.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it was a plague. It was awful.
There are photos upon photos of friend groups from this Castro district in San Francisco. And if you look through those albums, there are basically, of a group of 50 men, one of them is still alive to tell that story. The AIDS quilt that came out of that will give you the best visual representation of the immense loss of life. After we get through the basic right to exist and the basic right to be alive, you get the fight for the right to marry who you want.
Marriage equality.
Which happened very recently.
Extremely recently.
Still kind of happening.
It's still kind of happening.
Well, that's the thing you mentioned about the civil aspect of it, the right to keep their jobs and all of that. We're going through that right now with the trans community. Like, all of it's still, thanks to a certain government, completely fine to fire people or to target people because of their gender identity, which is horrific.
Right. I mean, I think we've seen lesbians and gays sort of, well, especially, we've seen gay men especially come through the sort of his historical struggle where they've slowly won their rights and acceptance. But now, I think what we're seeing is we're extending that same struggle and those same rights to all the other letters in the spectrum, and especially, our trans brothers and sisters out there who are facing some of the worst discrimination and some of the worst harassment of anyone today.
It's not over. Like, this fight isn't over. There are still people every day that are afraid to come out, and things are getting better. And it's lovely to see, like, all of the YouTube videos where people come out to their accepting families, and it's all like lovey and warmth and wonderful. And I'm all for that. That's great. But that's still not the story everywhere. I mean, especially not in the world. In the world, there are still many places where being queer will, mean your death. Like, you will be murdered for it. I mean, here in the States too, though, like, we still get gay bashings all the time. There's so much violence against the LGBTQIA community all the time. Looking at the number of trans women that have been murdered this year, which I think is 100% Black trans women.
Jesus.
Who have been murdered so far this year. Like, these statistics are horrifying because they're still happening. And that's why we still need Pride, is we still need to celebrate, hey, it's okay. It's okay to be gay. It's okay to be lesbian. It's okay to be bi. It's okay to be trans. It's okay to be intersex or genderqueer or any of the other terms. Because for a lot of people out there, they're not hearing that it's okay to be these things.
We still live in a world where conversion therapy is legal. We still live in a world... The Pulse shooting in Miami was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
We still live in a world where last year at Salt Lake City Pride, there was a group.
Yeah, 4 people had to rush into a... Was it a restaurant?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was like a Starbucks or something.
And one of the employees of the restaurant fought off the mob, which I think makes him
definitely a hero.
Yeah, local hero. But we still live in that world. It's so much better. Like, we've been talking a lot about how the cops would openly and forgivingly raid these bars. At West Hollywood Pride, which was earlier this month, the amount of cop cars with pride flags on them and openly gay cops walking down the street, I'm sure is something that was unthinkable 50 years ago.
The police commissioner here in New York City made a statement for Pride apologizing for the actions of the police because it was unforgivable.
Yeah.
Like,
so much further to go, but we have made so much distance. And I don't think we should forget either of those things.
Yeah. So in Boston, there are these
we're going to talk about that?
Yes! There are people who believe that they need to have a straight pride. And the reason that I'm bringing this up isn't because I think that hetero people should be ashamed of being hetero. That's not it at all. The conversation that I want to have is why we have a pride versus why a straight pride is unnecessary. This is what we were fighting. Before the Stonewall Riots, before the Pride Parade, before any of this, people were not allowed to be on the street caring for the person that they love. You couldn't hold hands with somebody that you cared about. You couldn't live your life day to day with your companion, or you could face going to a Atascadero or getting arrested or being fired or so many different things. So what we're celebrating is our ability to be out, because before this point in time, before this point in history, we couldn't be. We were too afraid. We were in the closet literally because there was no out of the closet. We were persecuted because of who we loved or who we were or what our identities were that didn't match the definition that society put forward. So I'm not saying that, like, you shouldn't be proud for being hetero. That's not it at all. You've just never had to face the kind of persecution for the love that you have in this world, or for your sexuality, or for your gender, or for any of these things. So that's why I'm so against the straight pride parade, is because, cool, you've never had anything to be fearful for when it comes to these things. You don't need to celebrate who you are. Society already did that for you.
And as a straight person, I'm against the straight pride parade because the narrative that they are selling is not what I celebrate in, I guess, my heterosexuality. Nothing that they are saying as their, like, I don't know, manifesto really matches with anything that I believe represents respectful love for me. And honestly, when I look at it, like, you can be a straight person and go to Pride as, like, an ally, or also a huge part of Pride, like, well, I cannot even begin to understand what it would mean to get fired for having sex with my husband. I can't even begin to understand what it would mean to fear that my parents would send me to electroshock therapy just to say that I have a partner, or I have an attraction, or any of these things. I can't even begin to sympathize with that. But a huge part of Pride is openly celebrating sexuality. And as anyone, that is a beautiful thing. Because that's not something society does almost ever.
Yeah, Megan, that's so true. Like, the straight pride narrative is so much like, well, we're proud of being hetero because it's the way, the truth, and the light. Like, it's the right answer. Whereas the pride parade is really about being like, we're finally, like, able to accept who we are and who everybody else is, and it's all about, like, acceptance of everyone, and allies are very important and a part of that as well. So that's a good point to make, is there's this feeling of exclusion with straight pride that isn't the point of the Pride Festival.
It's not.
Also, these straight pride festival people are just a bunch of right-wing grifters. Like, I'm willing to bet that the Venn diagram of straight pride attendees and tiki torch Nazis is a circle.
100% overlap.
And, you know, as long as we're getting personal, we haven't talked about the bees very much. In this, but, you know, bisexual, just trying to convince people that you exist as a bisexual is hard, that it's not just a phase. You know, I'm pretty ashamed to admit that when Marcella first told me that she was bisexual, I didn't believe her.
Yeah.
And
no one does.
I don't know if you've ever talked about that.
No, not really. I'd actually be fascinated to hear more.
It was
nobody
a really
ever does.
shitty way to react, and I feel really, really bad for it, and I hope you forgive me.
Absolutely.
But, I think it's important to be honest on this podcast. But yeah, just like trying to convince people that you exist as a bisexual is really hard.
Yeah, and it's even within the community, which is so sad. It's like we preach so much acceptance, but bisexuality is still considered that, like, oh, you just aren't ready to come out yet, or or you're just taking a walk on the wild side because it makes you look cool. I got that so much in college, where everybody was just like, you just pretend to like girls so that other people think you're hot. And I'm like, nah, this is a cocky thing to say. I don't have a problem with people thinking I'm hot. I don't need to make out with girls in order to do it. Like, sorry.
That is the best response you can have to that.
I had such game in Salt Lake. I missed that.
Well, have you seen that interview that Anna Paquin did with Larry King?
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who don't know her, Anna Paquin was the lead actress from True Blood, open bisexual, ended up married to her co-star, who played Bill, who I don't remember his name, but he was interviewing her about how, since she's married to a man, she's straight now. And she's like, no, I'm still bisexual. I'm just married. Like, I'm still attracted to women, but since I'm in a committed monogamous marriage, I have sex with my husband, but it doesn't stop me from thinking that women are hot.
Yeah. It's like, do you lose all of your ability to consider other people other than your spouse when you get married? Because that's not real. You can tell yourself yes, but...
I'm currently having a love affair with Jamie from Outlander.
It's a whole thing. I am too, though. He's extremely beautiful.
The fight is not over. The fight, even today, is just fucking equality. God damn.
And I think, you either have to... it's either everybody or nobody. There's no excluding trans people or asexual people, or gender non-binary people. You either have to extend these rights and privileges to everybody, or it's all for nothing.
Yeah. And the second you start excluding, it snowballs. Like, every single quote from World War II, every single one of them talks about how the perfect nation came for one group, and then they came for another, and then they came for another. And if you think for 1 second that if you accept that one of the others is being excluded, that they're never coming for you, you have not been paying attention.
I want to mention how Stonewall is actually the first LGBTQ national monument. It's the very first one. Obama made it a national monument in 2016.
Thanks, Obama.
Yeah, seriously. Marriage equality and our first monument. He's my president.
I'm sure San Francisco is really upset that New York City outgayed them.
Yeah, we did. I'm sorry, San Fran. I've never been there. I'm sure I'll love it.
Oh, you've never been to San Francisco?
No.
Oh, it's fun.
It's on the list.
Even possible.
I know.
Expensive.
I know. You guys had Angels in America, okay? Give us this.
We also had the very first out-of-the-closet American politician.
Yes.
Harvey Milk.
Oh, Harvey Milk.
We've mentioned him so far, Colin.
Right.
He just had a straight man situation happening over here.
Oh, that's why there's a street named after him in Long Beach.
Yeah.
There's a lot of education to be spread about the LGBTQ movement and history, so I really want to give a shout out to some of our sources for this episode today. I really loved the PBS documentary, American Experience, Stonewall Uprising. I also used the History Channel. They had some really good articles. God, what else did I use? So many things. Britannica.
I want to shout out, we all watched that first documentary that Marcelo mentioned. I also watched Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's. There's the documentary How We Got Gay, which is available to you on Amazon.
As a quick personal aside, Colin, do you know the first time that I heard about the Stonewall Riots?
Was it the same time that I first heard about the Stonewall Riots?
Why, listener, I do think it was.
We've got a little Easter egg for you.
Colin, what show were we in college together?
Oh my gosh. We were in a play called Street Theater by Doric Wilson, who is featured quite heavily in the documentary we keep mentioning, the PBS American Experience Stonewall Uprising episode. So, did we lose you, Marcella?
No, I am here, and I am very excited about the things you're saying. Also, I, 2 weeks ago, went to the Stonewall Inn with a friend of ours from that show.
What?
And that was when that's when I was reminded that I have kissed you.
Oh, yes.
I think
I had blocked that out of my memory.
I think in honor of Pride Month, I think we should point out that Marcella has individually made out with both Colin and myself.
Yes, I
before
have.
we had a chance to make out with each other.
I'm raising the roof, listeners. I have kissed both those faces. I'm doing a little shimmy now.
You are, I think, the only person that is an Eskimo sister to our marriage.
I helped you guys go on your first date. I kissed both of you before you got kissed. Well, before you kissed each other. I am deep in this marriage, listeners.
You're part of this podcast now.
I hadn't thought of it that way before, but yes.
But yeah, sadly, I didn't know anything about our history until we did a show together about the Stonewall Riots. It's not a true to time, but it basically takes place the entire day of the Stonewall Riots.
Yeah, it's the day and night leading up to the riot.
Can I admit something very, 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 very shameful?
What?
I didn't know about Stonewall until people started making a big deal about the 50th anniversary of Stonewall.
Oh no.
I know.
Our true straight female.
I mean,
no, it's all good.
That's okay.
I think that
it's not a story the Mattachine Society would want to tell you.
It's a testament that we need better sex education in our schools.
And education of our revolutionary past.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, we need better history classes.
Yeah.
Also, yes. I had to memorize the Gettysburg Address on three different occasions. I'm sure they could have snuck down a Stonewall in there somewhere.
Yeah, I don't think that would fly in Utah.
Yeah, one can dream.
Maybe someday.
One can dream. Anyway, happy Pride Month, everyone. Or happy end of the Pride Month. Happy Pride Year. Happy Pride Life.
Yeah, happy Pride Life.
Happy Pride Life.
To all of you out there. All of you letters.
All the letters.
All the letters.
All the letters. And if I would like to propose that if this god-awful protest that I don't want to give any free advertising goes through in Boston, I'm trying to think of like what the most effective counter-protest would be, and honestly, I think it's a gender and sexual orientation open orgy, like on the the directly adjacent hillside.
I am so in.
A sex in, if you will. A bang in.
Yeah.
The first sex in.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely been a sex in before.
I think that's the entirety of the 70s. Yeah, and also, I just want to say to anyone who's never been to a Pride Festival before, I'm so sorry. We had, like, a whole plan, and I had all the dates of, like, the major cities in America and when their Pride Festivals were going, and it just got lost in this amateur podcast that we're doing.
We're growing. We're getting there. Next year.
So
but, I mean, take what we said to heart. Go research when your Pride Festival's going. And honestly, go. Get yourself whatever you're comfortable wearing. For me, it is a rainbow sequin sports bra and a pair of hot shorts.
And for me, it's latex.
But honestly, come in whatever makes you comfortable, even if it's just your everyday clothes, because this is an inclusive event. And you know what? Like, if you can't make it to Pride and you've never honestly interacted with the gay community, go check out some theater, or at the very entry level, enjoy Halloween this year in your gay district.
Yes.
Like, Halloween, the largest Halloween celebration in the world happens every year at West Hollywood, and it is phenomenal. If you live in Southern California and you've never gone, you should go.
Or if you don't like crowds, you can always go to your local Pride Center. I know there's one in Salt Lake. I know there's one here in Long Beach. Certainly one in LA. So they have classes. They have all volunteer opportunities, all sorts of things for you to get plugged into a community that understands you.
Yeah, listener, go ahead and Google your city, your town, and you know, find the gay community center. Find Salt Lake City just had its first annual LGBTQ arts festival this year. Like, there are events popping up everywhere. If you just Google it, I'm sure you'll find something in your area. Before we sign off, let's go ahead and say, if you're out and proud, congratulations to you. If you're not ready to be out, congratulations to you for knowing who you are, and I'm sure you'll come out at whatever time is best for you.
If you're in a place where you're really struggling and it's not safe for you to come out, don't lose hope. Your situation is temporary, and there are several resources out there to help you. The rate of suicide in the LGBTQIA community is still really big, and what you are going through, I am so sorry. Please reach out to one of these hotlines. Please get yourself some help. Remember that there are people out there who love you. Your family is not directly limited to the people that you are blood related to. Your family is anyone who loves you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. If you are someone who is not totally down with the gays, if you think you are a little bit homophobic, I do challenge you to get yourself into entry-level movies regarding it, all the ones that we listed. Start with RuPaul's Drag Race. Start with Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. Just start anywhere. There are so many ways to change your mind. And I do challenge you to try.
If you don't know any openly out people and you want to talk to a person, I'll talk to you. Let's do this. Come meet me. I'm a real life human being. I swear. Some people think I'm an alien, but I swear.
I just listed like so many things that had to do with penis havers in the community. All I can think of is Orange is the New Black. Does that make me a bad ally? I can't think of mainstream lesbians. I've never seen it.
Look, it's a dirty pleasure. It's a guilty pleasure. It's both. For the lesbian community, it's shameful to watch, but you know.
Fried green tomatoes. That's the quintessential lesbian movie.
The Favorite.
Oh yeah, that came out this year. I didn't see it.
Please tell me this is more of a mark on the state of our media and not me. Please.
Oh.
I think it is. But I'm a cheerleader.
I know there's more
That's
representation. I just can't think of any right now.
There's Blue is the Warmest Color. That's a little bit older, but good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one.
Wow, I haven't thought about that one in a minute. There's this really weird French musical movie that I love, and I won't be able to think of the name of, but that's a tripod, and it's a male and two females in a couple, and one of the females is bi. It's a weird musical, but it's good.
I am into it.
To look up the name. Okay, should we do our sign
let's
off?
sign
Are we rambling? Are you done?
All right.
That was our show.
I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining.
Thanks.
Happy Pride.
Pride.
To a person.
An absence of
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.
it continues